The Atlantic Ocean can be beautiful, calm, endless, the kind of water that makes you forget it has swallowed ships whole. But on one cold December afternoon in 1872, it became the setting for one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. From a distance, the ship looked ordinary, almost peaceful. Its sails were still catching the wind. It wasn't burning. It wasn't sinking. It hadn't been torn apart by a storm. It was simply drifting. As another merchant vessel slowly closed the distance, its crew braced for the usual scene. Sailors waving frantically for help, maybe a captain shouting across the water for a tow. Instead, something far stranger awaited them. There wasn't a single person on deck. No captain, no crew, no frightened passengers. Nothing. The ship appeared to be sailing itself, cutting cleanly through the swells as if the 10 people who had boarded her in New York had simply stepped off into thin air. The vessel's name was Mary Celeste. Within hours, experienced sailors would climb aboard expecting to solve a simple maritime emergency. A broken rudder, maybe a sick captain, something explainable. Instead, they would discover a scene so unsettling that, more than 150 years later, historians, scientists, investigators, and storytellers are still trying to explain it. The cargo remained on board. The food was still there. Fresh water hadn't run out. The crew's personal belongings had been left behind, tucked in drawers and hanging on hooks as if their owners planned to return within the hour. Even stranger, the ship itself was still capable of sailing. Nothing about her, structurally, said she needed to be abandoned. So why would an experienced captain voluntarily walk away from a functioning ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? That single question transformed an ordinary merchant voyage into perhaps the world's most famous ghost ship mystery. And the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the story became. Because almost everything people think they know about the Mary Celeste turns out to be wrong. The famous stories about untouched meals sitting on tables, the dramatic tales of blood-stained decks, the whispers of pirates, sea monsters, mutiny, even alien abductions, almost none of those claims are supported by a shred of evidence. So if the legends are false, what really happened out there? And why, after more than a century of investigation, has no single explanation ever managed to answer every question? Tonight, we're leaving the myths behind. We're following only the evidence. We'll retrace the final documented journey of the Mary Celeste, examine every major theory, separate verified fact from speculation, and uncover why modern researchers believe this mystery may not be supernatural at all. But that conclusion comes with a devastating implication. Because if the strongest explanation is correct, then Captain Benjamin Briggs and everyone with him may have survived the greatest danger aboard the ship, only to sail directly into an even deadlier fate. That possibility changes everything. Every mystery begins with an ordinary day. And in the case of the Mary Celeste, that ordinary beginning is exactly what makes what followed so difficult to understand. The story actually began years before the disappearance, long before newspapers called it a ghost ship, long before conspiracy theories spread across the world in cheap ink and cheaper imagination. Back then, the vessel had another name entirely. It was called Amazon. Built in Nova Scotia in 1861, the brigantine was designed for the demanding, unglamorous life of Atlantic trade. She wasn't a warship. She wasn't built for exploration or glory. She was a working ship, meant to carry cargo safely across thousands of miles of unpredictable ocean, one uneventful crossing at a time. Ships like Amazon formed the quiet backbone of 19th century commerce. They carried grain, cloth, tools, and raw materials between continents that depended on each other more than either side liked to admit. Their captains weren't thrill-seekers chasing adventure. They were professionals, cautious, calculating men whose entire livelihood depended on making the careful decision rather than the bold one. Years later, after changing hands, the vessel received a new name, Mary Celeste. No one could have imagined that this simple change of ownership and title would eventually attach itself to one of history's greatest maritime legends. By 1872, the ship was preparing for another routine commercial voyage. On paper, nothing about the mission looked extraordinary. Its destination was Genoa, Italy. Its cargo consisted of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, and its captain was considered one of the most careful, most trusted men who could be handed command of a ship. Benjamin Spooner Briggs wasn't known for recklessness. Not once, not ever. He was experienced, respected, methodical almost to a fault. Exactly the kind of captain merchants entrusted with valuable cargo, and the kind of man families trusted with their lives. That reputation would later become one of the biggest puzzles in the entire case. Because everything historians know about Briggs suggests he wasn't a man who panicked easily. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If he abandoned his ship, what frightened him enough to do it? But Captain Briggs wasn't sailing alone that November. This voyage was different in a way that would haunt every theory that followed. His wife, Sarah Briggs, had joined him, so had their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. Bringing family aboard wasn't unheard of in that era. Captains' wives often accompanied their husbands on long commercial routes. Still, it meant every decision Briggs made now carried a different kind of weight. He wasn't responsible only for cargo and crew. He was responsible for the 2 people he loved most in the world. That simple fact makes every later theory far more personal, far more human. It's one thing to imagine a captain taking a calculated risk with hired sailors. It's another thing entirely to imagine him lowering his wife and toddler into a small open boat, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, with land nowhere in sight. What could possibly justify a decision like that? No captain makes that choice lightly, especially not one with Briggs' reputation for caution. Joining the Briggs family were 7 experienced crewmen, handpicked for a voyage that was supposed to be nothing more than another line in the ship's log. Together, the small company departed New York on November 7, 1872. Their destination lay thousands of miles away, across open water that had swallowed better ships than this one. The voyage should have been uneventful. Merchant crews completed crossings just like it every single year. The Atlantic could certainly be dangerous, but experienced sailors understood storms, understood navigation, understood the 100 small inconveniences of life at sea. Nothing suggested this crossing would be any different, at least not at first. Weeks passed. The Mary Celeste pressed steadily toward Europe. The winds carried her east, day after gray day. The crew maintained the sails. Captain Briggs kept the ship's official log, the way every captain of every voyage did. Every entry mattered. Position, weather, course. Small, unremarkable observations that, taken together, told the story of a ship still very much in control of her own fate. Today, those surviving log entries provide some of the last direct evidence of life aboard the Mary Celeste. A paper trail leading straight toward a wall of silence. Then, silence. The final known log entry was dated November 25, 1872, near the Azores. After that, nothing. No final warning scrawled in a shaking hand. No desperate message stuffed into a bottle. No explanation of any kind. The written record simply ended, mid-voyage, as if the story itself had been cut with scissors. At first glance, that might not seem so unusual. Ships in 1872 didn't carry radios. Captains couldn't send word ahead to loved ones waiting on shore. A vessel could vanish from public knowledge for weeks before finally limping into port. But what happened over the next 10 days ensured the Mary Celeste would never complete that journey. Not the way anyone expected. Somewhere between that final log entry and early December, everything changed. No one knows exactly when. No one knows exactly why. And no one who witnessed those final hours was ever heard from again. Imagine the final moments for a second. Was there shouting? Did someone below deck swear the ship was taking on more water than she should? Did the smell of leaking alcohol creep upward through the hatches? Did rough seas convince an already uneasy captain that his vessel might founder before ever reaching land? Or was there another danger entirely, one no theory has fully captured even a century and a half later? Those questions have haunted investigators for generations, and they haven't gotten any easier to answer with time. But before anyone on land even knew the Mary Celeste had vanished, another ship was already closing the distance across the Atlantic. Its name was Dei Grazia. Its captain was David Morehouse. And within days, His crew would become witnesses to one of maritime history's most haunting discoveries, one that would follow them for the rest of their lives. December 5, 1872. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath an overcast sky, the kind of gray that makes the horizon disappear into the water. The crew aboard the Dei Grazia spotted another vessel in the distance. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Ships crossed paths constantly on the busy Atlantic trade routes. A passing sail barely earned a second glance. But as the hours passed, experienced sailors began noticing something wrong. The ship's movements weren't quite right. She drifted awkwardly, almost drunkenly. Her course seemed to wander with no hand guiding it. No one answered signals. No crew appeared on deck. For seasoned mariners, that kind of silence was never reassuring. Captain Morehouse ordered a closer approach. The two ships gradually closed the gap between them. Still no movement, no greeting, no sign of life at all. Eventually, a boarding party climbed aboard the mysterious vessel. The moment their boots touched her deck, they stepped into a mystery that has never truly ended. The first thing they noticed wasn't chaos. It was absence. There were no bodies, no injured sailors, no signs of a struggle, no captain waiting below with an explanation ready on his lips. The ship simply appeared empty. That alone would have been unsettling enough. But what they discovered next was even stranger. The Mary Celeste hadn't been destroyed. She hadn't even been abandoned in the kind of condition most people would expect from a ship in crisis. Instead, it looked as though the people on board had simply vanished in the middle of an ordinary voyage, mid-sentence, mid-task, as if the ship had been paused rather than emptied. And that single observation would send investigators down a path where every answer seemed to open the door to an even bigger question. The silence aboard the Mary Celeste wasn't the silence of destruction. It was the silence of interruption. As the boarding party moved cautiously across the deck, they expected each open door to finally reveal an explanation. An injured sailor curled in a corner, a frightened captain hiding below, some clear evidence of a violent struggle. Instead, every room only deepened the mystery. The crew quarters were empty. The captain's cabin was empty. The galley was empty. Everywhere they looked, the same unsettling conclusion stared back at them. Everyone was gone, and yet almost everything else remained exactly where it should be. That contradiction would become the defining feature of the entire case, the detail no theory has ever fully explained away. Because abandoned ships usually tell a story. Broken masts suggest storms. Blood suggests violence. Fire leaves scars behind. Pirates leave theft in their wake. The Mary Celeste told none of those stories. Instead, she presented investigators with something far more difficult to untangle. A scene that seemed almost normal. And that was exactly the problem. The cargo was still aboard. More than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol remained stacked in the ship's hold, untouched. Had pirates attacked, that valuable cargo would almost certainly have disappeared along with them. But it hadn't. Food supplies were still available. Fresh water remained on board. The crew's personal belongings had largely been left exactly where they were, undisturbed, unclaimed. Nothing suggested a desperate scramble to gather possessions before fleeing for their lives. That detail is often overlooked, but it shouldn't be. If Captain Briggs believed there was enough time to organize an orderly evacuation, why leave behind so many essential belongings? And if there wasn't enough time to grab even the basics, why was the ship still floating, calm and intact days later? That contradiction continues to frustrate historians today, more than 150 years on. As investigators examined the vessel more closely, they discovered something else. There was water inside the hold. To modern ears, that might sound alarming on its own. But ships of this period commonly carried some water below deck. It was simply part of sailing a wooden hull across open ocean. The real question wasn't whether water was present. It was whether there was enough of it to threaten the ship's survival. The evidence suggested there wasn't. The Mary Celeste was still seaworthy. She wasn't on the verge of sinking. She had survived long enough to drift across the Atlantic entirely on her own, with no one at the helm to steer her. That single fact immediately ruled out one of the most popular explanations. If the ship wasn't actually sinking, why abandon her? No experienced captain willingly trades a functioning ship for a small open boat unless the alternative feels even more dangerous. So what danger did Briggs believe he was facing? Investigators turned back to the ship's records. The final known log entry had been written on November 25th, near the Azores. By the time the Mary Celeste was discovered on December 5th, she had drifted a considerable distance without a single soul aboard. That raised another question. Had Captain Briggs intended to abandon the ship permanently? Or had he planned something else entirely? Something that simply went wrong? Modern researchers began asking a possibility earlier investigators had barely considered. What if the lifeboat was never meant to become a lifeboat at all? What if it was only ever meant to be temporary? That idea changes everything. Because if Briggs believed the danger would soon pass, he may have expected to return to his ship within the hour. But if the towing line connecting the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste failed, the ship would simply keep sailing. And the people aboard the smaller boat would not. Suddenly, one of history's strangest disappearances began to resemble something far more human. An unimaginable accident, not a supernatural one. But before anyone could reach that conclusion, investigators first had to eliminate the darker possibilities. And there were plenty of those waiting in line. When the Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar under tow, the abandoned vessel attracted enormous public attention. Salvage law required an official inquiry, at first glance a routine formality. Instead, suspicion crept into the investigation almost immediately. One man in particular refused to believe the disappearance could have happened naturally. Frederick Sollyflood, the Attorney General involved in the Gibraltar proceedings, grew deeply suspicious of everyone connected to the case. His imagination raced toward criminal explanations before the facts had even settled. Had the crew murdered Captain Briggs? Had pirates somehow escaped unnoticed, without stealing a thing? Had Captain Morehouse and the crew of the Dei Grazia staged the entire discovery for salvage money? These questions reshaped the entire investigation. But evidence proved remarkably difficult to find. If murder had occurred, where were the bodies? If pirates attacked, why leave behind such valuable cargo? If someone had planned insurance fraud, why abandon a perfectly usable ship instead of simply destroying it? Every theory seemed to answer one question while quietly creating three more in its place. Investigators searched carefully, methodically, for weeks, but no convincing evidence of foul play ever surfaced. The inquiry raised suspicion. It never came close to proving it. That distinction matters enormously, and it's one that history has often forgotten. Over the decades, many later writers quietly transformed early suspicions into supposed facts. But they weren't facts. They were questions. Questions that remained unanswered. And because they remained unanswered, imagination rushed in to fill every gap left behind. No one expected what happened next. The Mary Celeste stopped being a real investigation. She became a legend. Stories spread rapidly, each one wilder than the last. Pirates, mutiny, secret murders, sea monsters, the Bermuda Triangle, alien visitors, ghosts. Each generation added its own explanation. Each retelling grew more dramatic than the one before it. But almost none of them survived careful examination. Perhaps the most famous myth of all claimed the crew's meal still sat warm on the table when the boarding party arrived, steaming cups of tea beside half-eaten plates, as if the sailors had been snatched mid-bite. It's a wonderfully eerie image. It's also unsupported by a single shred of historical evidence. Likewise, the stories describing untouched cups of tea, mysterious bloodstains, or supernatural warning signs largely originated not from the actual investigation, but from later storytelling that borrowed the ship's name for its own purposes. One of the biggest influences arrived more than a decade after the disappearance. In 1884, a young author named Arthur Conan Doyle published a fictional story loosely inspired by the Mary Celeste. His tale was never presented as historical research. It was fiction, plain and simple. A writer's imagination stretched across a real ship's name. Yet many readers gradually blurred the line between the invented narrative and the real case. Over time, fictional details slowly hardened into accepted history. Ironically, the world's most famous ghost ship became even more mysterious precisely because people remembered the myths and forgot the evidence sitting right in front of them. That realization forces an uncomfortable question. If we strip away every legend, every embellishment, every campfire flourish, what evidence actually remains? The answer is both simpler and far more tragic. Modern historians began approaching the mystery differently. Instead of asking, what fantastic event happened here? They ask something far more practical. What would make an experienced, cautious captain leave a seaworthy ship? That shift in framing completely changed the direction of the investigation. Because maritime disasters rarely stem from one single catastrophic event. More often, they grow out of several small problems compounding at exactly the wrong moment. What researchers found next was even stranger than any ghost story. The evidence didn't point toward one dramatic disaster. It pointed toward a quiet chain of ordinary maritime problems that may have combined into an extraordinary, irreversible tragedy. The first clue came from something surprisingly mundane: the ship's pumps. At first, pumps hardly sound like the stuff of legend. But every sailing vessel of the era depended on them completely. Their purpose was simple: remove the water that inevitably crept into the hull. If the pumps worked properly, a captain could estimate exactly how much water had accumulated below deck. If they didn't, he lost one of his most critical sources of information, and with it, his confidence. Researchers noted that the Mary Celeste had previously carried coal on an earlier voyage. Coal leaves behind fine dust. That dust, mixed with other debris, may have quietly clogged the ship's pumps without anyone realizing it until it mattered most. If Briggs couldn't fully trust his pump readings, he may have faced an impossible question with no good answer. Was the water level actually manageable? Or was his ship quietly filling beneath his feet while the readings lied to him? Out on the open Atlantic, uncertainty can be every bit as dangerous as certainty. A captain doesn't need proof that his ship is sinking. He only needs enough doubt to believe that staying aboard has become the greater risk. But pump problems alone still don't explain everything. There had to be another ingredient feeding that fear, and researchers believe there may have been one, hidden inside the cargo itself. Those 1,701 barrels weren't carrying drinking alcohol meant for a dinner table. They contained industrial alcohol, far more volatile, far less forgiving. Over the course of the crossing, some of the wooden barrels may have leaked vapor. Not liquid vapor. Invisible. Highly flammable. The kind of danger that announces itself only by smell, until it's too late to do anything but react. Imagine standing below deck in that moment. You smell alcohol, perhaps more sharply than before. The pumps aren't giving you reliable numbers anymore. The sea is turning rougher by the hour. You already know your cargo is dangerous. Would you stay calm? Or would every unfamiliar creak of the hull suddenly sound like the beginning of the end? For years, historians debated whether leaking vapor alone could have frightened an experienced crew into abandoning ship. Then chemistry entered the investigation and gave the theory real weight. Andrea Sella, a chemist at University College London, examined a fascinating possibility. He suggested that alcohol vapor, under the right conditions, could produce a pressure wave explosion. Not the kind Hollywood usually shows. No towering fireball. No charred, blackened timbers left behind as proof. Instead, something quieter and arguably more terrifying. A sudden blast powerful enough to shake the whole ship and terrify everyone aboard, while leaving behind surprisingly little visible damage for investigators to find later. Experiments demonstrated that such an event was physically plausible. Not proven, plausible. That distinction matters more than it might seem. No one can say with certainty that an alcohol vapor explosion actually occurred aboard the Mary Celeste. Only that it could explain something historians had struggled to reconcile for generations. A frightened captain, an apparently undamaged ship, and an orderly, almost calm-looking evacuation. Suddenly, pieces that once seemed completely unrelated began fitting together into something coherent. But one final piece of evidence would change the entire picture and turn a mystery into a tragedy. Because even if Briggs genuinely feared for the ship, one question remains unanswered. Why choose the open ocean? The answer may lie not in panic, but in calculation. And that possibility transforms Captain Briggs from a mysterious, almost cautionary figure into a deeply tragic one. The image most people carry of the Mary Celeste is a simple one: a haunted ship, an impossible disappearance, a mystery beyond all rational explanation. But by the beginning of the 21st century, researchers had begun asking a very different question. What if the Mary Celeste was never the real mystery? What if the true mystery was the lifeboat? That single shift in perspective would go on to reshape one of history's greatest maritime enigmas. For generations, people imagined Captain Benjamin Briggs making a wildly irrational decision, abandoning a perfectly seaworthy ship, choosing a tiny open boat over a vessel built to cross oceans. It seemed absurd on its face, until modern investigators considered the possibility that Briggs never intended to abandon his ship permanently at all. What if the yawl, the ship's missing lifeboat, was never meant to become a lifeboat in the true sense? What if it was only ever meant to be a short, temporary retreat? That possibility changes the entire shape of the story. Experienced captains sometimes used small boats to inspect damage from a safer distance, keep clear during a perceived emergency, or simply wait out a threat until it passed. If Briggs believed the danger aboard the Mary Celeste was temporary, he likely expected to remain tethered to her, connected by a line, not separated by open water. That distinction is critical. He may never have imagined, even for a moment, that the Mary Celeste would continue sailing on without him. Modern researchers reconstructed the ship's likely movements using every scrap of available evidence. Among them was oceanographer Phil Richardson, whose work explored exactly how the Mary Celeste could have drifted across the Atlantic after her crew vanished. His conclusion was striking. The ship's movement after abandonment appeared entirely possible without a single person aboard to steer her. Wind and current alone could have carried her precisely to where she was found. That discovery solved one piece of the puzzle. The Mary Celeste didn't need a ghostly crew to keep sailing. Nature alone was more than enough. But solving that mystery only opened a far larger, far darker one. If the ship could keep sailing on her own, how quickly would she have vanished from the perspective of a small boat struggling in rough seas nearby? The answer is deeply unsettling. A fully rigged sailing vessel catches vastly more wind than a small open yawl ever could. If a towing line snapped or had to be cut in a hurry, the larger ship could begin pulling away with startling speed. Imagine standing in that small boat, your family beside you, 7 sailors rowing with everything they have left. The ship sits only a short distance away, close enough to reach, close enough to believe you still have a chance. Then, the wind catches her sails. Foot by foot, she begins to move. Someone shouts. The crew rows harder, arms burning, throats raw. Another wave crashes hard across the bow, stealing precious seconds. The distance grows anyway. The ship becomes smaller. Soon, the only visible chance of survival is disappearing over the horizon, sail by sail, until there's nothing left to row toward. No witness survived to tell us whether that is truly what happened. No final journal exists to confirm it. No distress signal was ever sent because there was likely no way left to send one. But if this reconstruction comes close to the truth, then the greatest mystery of the Mary Celeste may never have unfolded aboard the ship at all. It unfolded after everyone had already left it. That possibility transforms the entire story, from one built on horror into one built on heartbreaking irony. Captain Briggs may have successfully evacuated everyone from what he believed was immediate, mortal danger, only to condemn all of them to a far greater one waiting just beyond the ship's rail. The Atlantic itself. Open boats on the 19th century ocean offered painfully little protection against what the sea could do. Exposure, cold, sudden storms, waves that towered over a boat barely larger than a rowboat. Even if conditions seemed manageable in that first hour, the weather could deteriorate with almost no warning at all. Without the shelter of the brigantine, survival would have depended on extraordinary, almost impossible luck. And luck, it seems, may simply have run out somewhere over the horizon. There is one detail that makes this theory even more devastating than it already is. Briggs wasn't thinking only as a captain in that moment. He was thinking as a husband, and as a father. Sarah Briggs had trusted her husband enough to make this crossing beside him. Little Sophia was only 2 years old, too young to understand any of what was happening around her. No responsible father willingly places his wife and daughter into an open Atlantic lifeboat unless he genuinely believes it offers the better chance of survival, however slim that chance might be. That single fact tells us something important about his state of mind in those final hours. Whatever danger he believed existed aboard the Mary Celeste, he believed it was immediate. Immediate enough to leave behind the safety, however uncertain, of a whole ship. Whether that fear grew from unreliable pump readings, the smell of leaking alcohol vapor, rough and worsening seas, or several of these problems compounding all at once, we simply cannot know for certain, and probably never will. And that uncertainty is precisely why this mystery refuses to fade quietly into history. Today, 3 explanations stand well above all the others in credibility. The first centers on the pumps. If they were clogged by leftover debris from an earlier coal cargo, Briggs may have had no reliable way to determine how much water was actually entering the hull. Faced with that uncertainty, he may have concluded his ship was sinking faster than she actually was. The second focuses squarely on the cargo. Leaking industrial alcohol may have released dangerous, invisible vapor below deck. Chemist Andrea Sella demonstrated that a pressure wave explosion could occur without leaving the obvious scorch marks people usually expect to find. Such an event could have terrified everyone aboard while leaving the ship largely, deceptively intact. The third theory weaves together navigation, weather, and simple human judgment under pressure. If Briggs believed he was near enough to land close to the Azores, a temporary evacuation may have felt entirely reasonable in the moment. He may have expected rescue soon after, or planned to return to the ship once conditions settled. None of these 3 theories, taken alone, explains every single detail of the case. But together they paint a remarkably human picture. Not one of blind panic, not one of superstition, but of an experienced, careful captain making the best decision he could, with dangerously incomplete information and almost no time to weigh his options. That may be the cruelest lesson buried inside this entire story. Sometimes tragedy doesn't require impossible events or supernatural forces. Sometimes it begins with ordinary, capable people making reasonable decisions under extraordinary, unforgiving pressure. And yet, the mystery remains, stubborn as ever, because there are questions no investigation has ever fully answered, no matter how many decades pass. What exact moment convinced Briggs to leave? Did a sudden noise below deck trigger the evacuation? Did the crew actually witness some kind of small explosion with their own eyes? Was the weather worse in those final hours than the surviving records suggest? Did the tow line snap on its own? Or was it cut deliberately, in a moment of panic that made sense only to the person holding the knife? Did the lifeboat overturn in the swells? Did everyone survive that first terrible night, only to perish slowly over the days that followed? No evidence has survived to answer any of it. No bodies were ever recovered. No eyewitness accounts ever emerged from anywhere along the Atlantic's edges. No final message ever washed ashore to close the story properly. History simply fell silent. And silence, it turns out, can be far more haunting than any ghost story ever written. Perhaps that's exactly why the Mary Celeste continues to fascinate us more than a century and a half later. Not because it proves the supernatural is real, but because it reminds us how fragile our certainty about the world truly is. For more than 150 years, people have combed this story for monsters, pirates, conspiracies, and paranormal forces lurking just out of frame. Yet the strongest evidence points somewhere far less dramatic and far more unsettling. Toward human judgment, toward imperfect information, toward the genuinely terrifying reality that intelligent, experienced people can make decisions that look completely irrational, but only after we already know how the story ends. The Mary Celeste doesn't ask us to believe in ghosts. It asks us to imagine standing exactly where Captain Briggs once stood, with none of the hindsight we now take for granted. The pumps may not be telling you the truth. The cargo smells wrong in a way it never has before. The sea is changing beneath your feet. Your wife and young daughter are looking to you for reassurance you're not sure you actually have. Your crew is waiting on your order, and they're waiting now. You have only minutes to decide. Stay aboard. Or leave. Knowing what happened afterward, it's easy for any of us to say what we would have done differently. But Briggs didn't have that advantage. He had only the evidence directly in front of him, in that exact moment, with no way to see past it. And history suggests that evidence may have been more than terrifying enough to justify what came next. In the end, the Mary Celeste was never found wrecked at the bottom of the ocean, as so many ghost stories assume she must have been. She was found exactly where no one expected her to be. Still sailing, still carrying her cargo, still waiting patiently and uselessly for a crew that would never come back to claim her. Years later, her own story would finally reach its ending. In 1885, long after the disappearance that made her infamous around the world, the ship was deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti as part of a clumsy insurance fraud scheme. It was an ordinary, almost petty crime that brought down an extraordinary vessel. But it did nothing at all to answer the question that mattered most, the one people still ask today. What actually happened to the 10 people who vanished into the Atlantic that December? Perhaps we will never truly know. The ocean rarely gives back all of its secrets. Its storms erase tracks. Its currents scatter evidence across thousands of miles. Its silence preserves mysteries far longer than any archive or courtroom transcript ever could. And maybe that's exactly why the Mary Celeste still captures our imagination the way it does. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it steadfastly refuses to. She stands at the exact intersection of fact and legend, the place where verified evidence runs out and human imagination quietly takes over. Every generation has tried to solve her mystery in its own way. Every generation has added its own theory to the pile. Yet the most convincing explanation may also be the saddest one on offer. There may have been no mutiny, no pirates, no sea monster, no supernatural force of any kind. Only a careful, experienced captain trying desperately to save the people entrusted to his care, making a decision that, under the exact circumstances he faced, may have seemed completely reasonable at the time. If that's true, then the Mary Celeste isn't really history's greatest ghost ship at all. She's history's greatest reminder that the line between survival and disaster can be as thin as a single rope, stretched taut between a ship and a lifeboat, waiting to see which one snaps first. Somewhere beneath those same waters lie countless other stories that were never recorded at all. Ships whose crews were never found. Voyages that ended without a single witness left to describe them. Mysteries that survive only because the sea decided to keep their final moments entirely to itself. And perhaps the next great maritime mystery is still out there right now, waiting patiently, hidden somewhere just beyond the horizon, in the exact place where history quietly fades into the endless Atlantic.